So I would like to thank the comrades from Zetkin for the invitation and for organizing these three passionate days. Like any activist, I am merely the mouthpiece for ideas that are developed collectively, and a very large part of what I will share with you today has been shaped in the wake of 2 decades of autonomous anti-fascist activism in Paris, particularly by Action Anti-Fasciste Paris Banlieue, which is probably the most emblematic organization of its kind in France. So, fascism is back in Europe, this is undeniable, and it raises crucial questions for our camp at a time when such questions are piling up and defeats are mounting globally. Today I will speak about the situation in France, trying to explore the reflexes at play within anti-fascist movements and the long-term viability of the new Popular Front strategy that emerged last year following the dissolution of the National Assembly. This dissolution occurred in a broader context, where the far right has been steadily approaching power amid the crumbling of traditional governing parties, both of the right and of the so-called center-left. And this collapse, largely driven by an increasingly authoritarian and neoliberal dynamic, has reshaped French politics around basically 3 main blocks: a bourgeoisie bloc, embodied first and all by Macron and its recruits from upper classes and former establishment parties, a hard-right fascist-leaning bloc led by the Rassemblement National national rally, though with competition on both its right and its left, and finally, leftist breakaway bloc represented electorally by La France Insoumise and socially by a kind of decade of powerful social movement and anti-racist struggles, which actually makes kind of an exception in Europe. This tripartite division became especially visible in 2022, resulting in a kind of new situation under the Fifth Republic, where the president no longer has the majority in the National Assembly. And last year, following the National Front victory in the European elections, Macron chose to dissolve the Assembly, which actually was kind of a rather foolish decision from the perspective of his own camp, but I mean, I guess we have the Bonaparte we deserve. And calling elections just 1 month later was practically a gift to fascists. And it actually led to the formation of a united front between the major forces of the electoral left, including the Socialist Party with an extremely right-leaning, and with support from key labor unions, namely CGT, which is quite rare. And this coalition came first in the election with a relatively ambitious program inspired largely by social movements, featuring extremely significant progress on Islamophobia, on police violence, on ecology, and social questions. And de facto, the Popular Front worked, meaning that it succeeded in defeating the far right, which hasn't been part of the French government since 1944, contrary to Italy or elsewhere. But the lack of absolute majority allowed Macron to delay forming a new government for 2 months, a 2 months coup, again, we have the Bonaparte we deserve, and then to appoint a new government led by the traditional right, despite the fact that it was, it finished last in the election. And this government is basically under the control of the far right, which still appears nonetheless to many as an alternative, since it governs without formally participating in the government. Meanwhile, the new Popular Front has basically collapsed, largely because significant factions within the Socialist Party and the right wing of the Ecological Party refused to align with La France Insoumise pro-Palestinian and anti-Islamophobia stance. So there's a real possibility that the Assembly could be dissolved again, and the 2027 presidential elections are on the horizon. So the question of anti-fascist strategy is basically, again, on the resurfaces, basically, along with kind of familiar dilemmas. Can we label certain organizations or policies as fascist? Should we speak of fascism, or should we speak of authoritarian neoliberalism? Should we continue playing the game of Republican fronts every election Sundays? Are the tactics of anti-fascist resistance back on the agenda? Or is it still meaningful to rely on the framework of social democracy? Or is it time to acknowledge that it has long since ceased to mean anything for those who govern us? This is a particularly thorny question because it arises in a moment when anti-fascist identity in France has become increasingly diluted, claimed across a broad spectrum. Today, the same people that are banning collectives fighting against Islamophobia or far-right are banning also far-right groups. The same people who want to grant a license to kill to young black and Arab men to the Republican police are claiming to be the last democratic bulwark against the far right. And it is the same people in the government who ban demonstrations in support of Palestine while invoking the memory of the resistance to Nazism as a shield for the French Jewish community. My hypothesis is that the ongoing genocide in Gaza should be a moment of reckoning for our camp, bringing to a close what could be called the era of moral anti-fascism, particular to the West. This term refers to a political framework that reduces fascism to organized far-right groups, seen primarily as archaic remains. In this worldview, Republican anti-fascism means basically the support for the post-1945 institutions with the ultimate goal of electoral harmony on Sunday nights. For moral anti-fascists, ever since World War II, history has been a linear path toward progress, where racist horror is either leftover of the past or system error. The spread of global markets is seen as inherently promoting peace and minority rights, while occasional setbacks from rogue states. But actually, the genocide in Gaza clashes head-on with that narrative. Andreas Malm calls it the first genocide of late capitalism. And what makes this genocide unique is the full coordination and complicity of the West. In Rwanda or elsewhere, imperial centers were obviously complicit by inaction. But in Gaza, Western countries, especially US and Germany, arms shipments have enabled the bombings with also France involved. Throughout the genocide, Western leaders have parroted Israel's right to self-defense, and large swaths of the Western press actively serve Israeli propaganda. The same journalists who praise freedom uncritically repeat Hasbara fake news while downplaying or ignoring Israel's crimes that are well documented by international institutions. So the horror of moral anti-fascism lies perhaps in this. The genocide of Palestinians is actually justified in the name of remembering the genocide of European Jews. Capitalist Western powers once again reveal their genocidal face, this in the name of memory. But if Gaza marks the end of moral anti-fascism, let us recall that even in 1945, the supposed innocence masked an ongoing latent fascism, always presented as a toolkit of practices and techniques. Take Israel. Long hailed as the only democracy in the Middle East, its response to October 7 reignited debates on whether its government is fascist. From Haaretz editorials to Ziv Sternel, claims of Israel's fascization are not new. Before October 7, actually, Western media sympathetically covered protests against Netanyahu's constitutional reforms. Yet, as Alberto Toscano points out, Palestinians were systematically absent from these discussions. Fascism only referred to what impact Western populations, not decades of violences against Palestinians. This colonial blind spot actually also applies to France. On May 8, 1945, Victory Day in France, it was also the day of the massacres in Sétif, Guelma, and Kerata in Algeria, where tens of thousands of Algerians were killed during anti-colonial protests. A reminder, if one was needed, that fascist exceptions in France are often just the domestic echo of colonial norms. As Résistance Algérienne, pro-Algerian newspaper once wrote, what is fascism if not colonialism within traditionally colonialist countries? From the start, the anti-fascist narrative obscured a more troubling reality, the persistence of French fascist elements aligned with anti-communist and decolonization wars. in 1954, amid the defeat of Dien Bien Phu and the start of the Algerian insurgency, fascist gangs regrouped in mainland France. Recruiting from veterans of Indochina and Africa, they attacked Communist Party headquarters and burst the OAS metro. Colonial counterinsurgency provided both space and manpower for the far right. A few years later, power struggles erupted between two military political factions that emerged from this logic, leading to the birth of the current Fifth Republic. At the same time in Europe, NATO's secret armies were recruiting from the ranks of defeated fascist troops and played a decisive role in the anti-communist struggle across the continent. Who better than fascists to fight communists, summarized one of the American operatives stationed in Italy at the time. France's particularly perhaps lies in the fact that de Gaulle, wary of the American ties to OAS and some of the far-right groups, decided to create his own agency, the Direct Action Service. Then, in 1968, faced with the popular uprising, de Gaulle went to Baden-Baden in Germany to meet with General Massu in order to secure the support of the OS lost soldiers, whose members were soon to be granted amnesty. It was in this context that a lot of new groups, Groupe Union Défense, Ordre Nouveau, Grèce, were born, groups that would later give rise to the Rassemblement National and serve as a kind of breeding ground for the cadres of French fascism. What emerges is an apparently purely instrumental relationship with the far right, one that could be seen continuing with the support given by the socialist Mitterrand during the 1980s to the rise of the National Front. So basically the right would use far-right gangs and its networks within the deep state and the army to ensure the defeat of the Red Threat, and the left, meanwhile, the socialist left, would use the far-right institutionally to weaken the right and the Communist Party at the ballot box. But what actually takes shapes is a far more complex and dialectical phenomenon, developing as France sinks deeper into neoliberalism. As privatization accelerates, as hard-won social gains are unraveled one by one, and as the space for compromise within the bourgeoisie narrows, the role of the far right in the French political system begins to change. Although cast as a monstrous outsider, completely alien to the acceptable political field, the far right in reality plays a kind of dual role, as a supplier of fascist ideas, but also as a justification for the implementation of racist and authoritarian politics. By rolling out the red carpet while constantly dissociating from it, moral anti-fascism of the ruling capitalist bloc helps advance far-right ideas while giving them a subversive gloss. The electoral successes that inevitably follow them provide the perfect excuse for successive governments to implement major portions of the far-right government and program. As early as 2008, for example, Daniel Ben Said noted that by 2005, the Chirac government, so kind of right-wing traditional government, had implemented 11 out of 24 security measures from the National Front 2011 platform, while the so-called right-wing government won as an anti-fascist against the National Front in 2002. So two clarifications are needed here. First, the elites continuously justify the racist turn by pointing to the alleged racism of the white working class. But it's far from that simple. One nuance to this oversimplified narrative is the fact that despite the racist surge in the media and among the political class, there is no mass fascist movement in France. That doesn't mean nothing is happening. Far-right gangs are spreading and attempting to revive kind of agitation tactics. Far-right terrorist plots are being foiled, and racist arcs are obviously on the rise. But it must be said, we are still very far from a situation of mass fascist activity on the streets. On the contrary, though they tried to be present in some social movements, for instance the Yellow Vest, they were pushed out by revolutionary activists. They failed to turn the anti-health, anti-COVID pass protests into the mass movements they hoped for, and they were beaten back when they tried to appear during the riots after one young Arab was killed by the police last year. Even though the National Rally opposed the pension reform, it led no marches, and its mistraining in the National Assembly doesn't translate to a presence in the massive popular demonstrations. Today's fascists differ from those from the 1930s. They are, for now, incapable of embedding themselves in or competing with the social movement. We are far from mass fascist politics and the fear once inspired by black shorts or militias capable of pogroms and coups. Contemporary fascism is actually way more diffuse, fashionable even, disseminated through social media or propagated via ideological apparatuses like CNews TV station and certain YouTube self-help channels touting a kind of tough white guy aesthetic. The real danger lies in the possible fusion of a generation raised on this content with a network of police officers, ex-cops, ex-soldiers, ready-made for forming a militia without needing to be politically organized. This formation doesn't exist yet, but it could emerge in the unlikely event of a future social democratic electoral victory, basically a victory by La France Insoumise. Second clarification needed. The ongoing authoritarian shift we've been experiencing for nearly 2 decades, from the 2004 law banning the veil in schools to the separatism law, from anti-riot and anti-terror laws to the progressive suppression of basically mediating bodies through repeated dissolutions and the expansion of state of emergency, there's a whole trajectory. Which you could, you could add to that the imperialist interventions abroad and the belligerent cries of those pushing for today rearmament. All this is obviously fueled by far-right ideologues, but it would be a mistake to imagine that they alone hold the reins of reactions. As the neoliberal crisis deepens and its ideological grip loosens, the parties of government reconnect with the darker sides of their own history. The Socialist Party, for instance, moves to enshrine the state of emergency in the constitution of the 2015 Islamist attacks, echoed socialist Guy Mollet actions during the Algerian war. The right-wing government didn't have to look far to draft the law banning headscarves in public schools. This is actually a crucial point that Republican anti-fascism has tried to obscure. The development and implementation of fascist policies not only draw from colonial and exploitative practices of capitalist states, but also enlist a range of actors far beyond the traditional far right. Pierre Laval, the basically first guy of the Vichy government, after all, was actually a thoroughly sincere socialist in 1939. And that is key to dismantling the fetishism of the turn or the basculement in French. Our side often remains trapped in the idea that one day suddenly a great night will mark the advent of fascism, just as for some a great night will also suddenly usher in communism. Given the current state of affairs, with no mass fascist movements on the horizon, but also with the revolutionary camp in deep decline, it is highly likely that any future turn could also take the form of a perfectly conventional election without the need for a Reichstag fire. However, since this far right is fully aligned with capitalist interest as well as with transatlantic imperialism, it is very unlikely to fulfill even its meager social promises, except perhaps to drastically intensify state racism. So what must be emphasized is that the culmination of the normalization process could very well result in the far right being fully integrated into the political game of alternation that defines moral anti-fascism in France. We will then witness what Utsa Prabhat Patnaik coined as lingering fascism of less murderous intensity. It is therefore necessary to break with the idea of an irreversible tipping point or a dramatic fascist great night. What we need today is a less rigid, narrowly defined concept of the far right or fascism, and more an understanding of the dialectic between the extreme center and the extreme right, and an analysis of the dynamic this creates in order to fight it effectively. I've said that Gaza marks the end of the era of moral anti-fascism, also known as institutional or republican anti-fascism. But we know that sometimes corpses take a long time to die, especially in our camp. That's why immediate actions must be taken to avoid being haunted by zombies. The first one is that the fight against fascism cannot be reduced to the fight against organized far-right groups. This is a double mistake. First, it entirely misses the target of what might actually lead us toward fascism. Second, it reproduces the illusion of moral anti-fascism by targeting only the far right, by turning it into a kind of absolute evil that justifies even temporary alliances with the most systematic and managerial forces. We commit political suicide, cutting ourselves off from revolts and the popular masses. Because resistance to fascism in France takes place above all in the streets. So far, it has been the most effective way to push back its growing hegemony, to sideline the centrality of its questions, and to undo the effectiveness of its slogans. The street refers to the series of social explosions that have made of France the stage for the most intense conflict in Europe over the past 10 years. From the struggle against the labor law protest to the struggle against the pension reform movement, from the struggle against the airport near Nantes to censoring demonstration, from the Dignity March and protest against police violence in memory of Adama to the revolt for Naël in last year. The current mobilizations have been rising last year, and generations of struggle erupt, challenging the racist and authoritarian consensus spreading among the elites. It is to the connection between these struggles that anti-fascism today must commit to, without deluding ourselves about the real contradictions that exist, for example, between the environmental movement and non-white uprisings in metropolitan centers. We must hold firm to the principle of autonomy for these struggles while working towards a way to articulate them together into victorious, practical fronts. Because what we lack today is a space for collective strategic elaboration, one capable of moving beyond the old binary between institutional and extra-parliamentary politics. Not just to organize for tactical actions, but to be able to craft a grand narrative of popular unity that can attract part of the abstentionist bloc and a fracture of the 10 million National Rally voters. To weave this network of alliances, we must let go of the ethos tied to moral anti-fascism, that of respectability and clean hands, an ethos that leads some of us to avoid speaking plainly about occupied Palestine, or to distance themselves from certain street practices or fields of struggles out of fear of isolation. The time for respectability is over. Capital no longer seeks compromise, and the strategy that sought to oppose traditional union strikes to the social strikes of young people burning trash bins last year during the last pension movement has led us into a wall. We must yellow vest the social movement, even as we maintain a hard union line. We must disarm, that is, concretely neutralize the machinery of ecological disaster, while also creating spaces for mass mobilization during protests and movements. This reflexive attitude towards power also applies to the popular movement. Let's remember all those comrades who turned their noses up at Yellow Vest, who didn't speak the language of 2.0 activism. Those who didn't hesitate to enter the movement and polarize it from within helped actually to push out the organized fascists who are trying to steer in a reactionary direction. If we refuse to get our hands dirty in the complexity of social movement, we will be incapable of combining various realities and sensibilities and different practical approaches. Just as now we have les soulèvements de la terre, we also need uprisings against police violence, against imperialism, against the high cost of living, and obviously against the genocide in Gaza. This is the only path to forming an offensive new popular bloc. And there will be actually no escape outside of this bloc. Whatever the scenario, acceleration of the neoliberal catastrophe under a new Macron, sharp fascist drift, betrayal or opportunism by the left wing, or a generalized assault by the bourgeoisie against even a minimally social democratic government, the need to impose a strong balance of power from outside the parliamentary system will remain the same. This is the only way to build a meaningful alternative where the seeds of a new life can grow, one that frees us from a capitalism that will never hesitate to turn to fascism as a genocidal last resort to enforce its own agenda. Thank you.